July 22nd, 1988. A mother stands on a Manhattan terrace, 14 stories above the city, watching her son balanced on the ledge. She reaches out, begs him to step back. He looks at her one last time and asks a question that will haunt her for the rest of her life. Then he's gone. This wasn't the first tragedy Gloria Vanderbilt had lived through. It wouldn't be the last. 4 sons. 4 completely different paths, each marked by loss in ways the world would struggle to understand. This is their story. The heiress who wanted to be a mother. Gloria Vanderbilt was born into American royalty. February 20th, 1924, Manhattan, the only child of railroad heir Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt. When she was just 18 months old, her father died from cirrhosis, leaving her heir to a trust fund worth $5 million, the equivalent of $90 million today. But money couldn't buy what Gloria craved most desperately: a normal family, unconditional love, the feeling of being wanted for who she was, rather than what she represented. Her childhood became a spectacle. At 10 years old, she was the center of what newspapers called the trial of the century. Her mother and her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, fought for custody in court proceedings that filled tabloids with scandalous details about Gloria's mother's lifestyle, her relationships, her fitness as a parent. The trial started in September 1934 and lasted for months, every day bringing new revelations that were splashed across front pages nationwide. Gloria's nanny, the beloved Dodo who'd raised her since infancy, was called to testify. She described Gloria's mother as neglectful, more interested in parties and travel than in her daughter. There were allegations of drinking, of inappropriate relationships, of a lifestyle completely unsuited to raising a child. Witnesses testified about seeing things no child should see, about Gloria being exposed to adult situations, about her mother's relationship with a Marchioness that sparked whispers and speculation. Gloria herself was questioned by the judge in private. She was 10 years old, asked to choose between her mother and her aunt, forced to articulate preferences she probably didn't fully understand. The judge asked if she wanted to live with her mother. Reports suggest she said no, that she'd been happier with her aunt, that her mother frightened her. Whether this reflected Gloria's true feelings, or whether she'd been coached, influenced, shaped by the adults around her who had their own agendas, remains unclear. The judge awarded custody to her Aunt Gertrude. Gloria was raised in luxury at Gertrude's mansion in Old Westbury, surrounded by cousins and privilege, but starved for the maternal affection she craved. She spent summers with her mother under supervised conditions, watched carefully to ensure her mother didn't exert too much influence. Every moment of contact was scrutinized, recorded, judged. The press followed her everywhere. Photographers camped outside whatever house she was staying in. She couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, pointed at, whispered about. Years later, Gloria would describe the trial as one of the most traumatic experiences of her childhood. Not just being caught between 2 women who claimed to love her, but being turned into public property, having her private life dissected in newspapers, losing any sense of normalcy or privacy. The experience shaped everything that came after. The experience shaped everything that came after. Gloria grew up determined to create the family she'd never had, to be the mother she'd needed. She married for the first time at 17, seeking escape, seeking love, seeking something that looked like home. The marriage to Pat DiCicco was a disaster. He was abusive, called her cruel names, hit her. She would later describe how he'd grab her head and bang it against the wall, how she'd had black eyes, how she'd lived in fear. They divorced in 1945, and Gloria walked away having learned that wealth and beauty didn't protect you from pain. Within weeks, she married again. Leopold Stokowski was a world-renowned conductor, 42 years her senior, famous for conducting the symphonies in Disney's Fantasia. He was sophisticated, cultured, artistic, everything Pat wasn't. And with him, Gloria finally had what she'd wanted. Children. A family of her own. The first sons, Stan and Christopher. Leopold Stanislaus Stokowski was born on August 22nd, 1950. They called him Stan. 2 years later, on January 31st, 1952, Christopher Stokowski arrived. Gloria finally had her family. 2 beautiful boys, a brilliant husband, a life that looked perfect from the outside. But perfection is a facade that rarely survives close inspection. Leopold Stokowski, for all his genius with music, was controlling. He encouraged Gloria's art, but isolated her socially. She felt trapped, confined, unable to be herself. When she was 30, she had a brief affair with Frank Sinatra, a rebellion against the cage her marriage had become. She and Sinatra remained friends for the rest of his life, but the fling made clear what Gloria already knew. This marriage wasn't what she needed. In 1955, Gloria divorced Stokowski. She had her 2 sons, primary custody, and the determination to build a different kind of life. Stan and Christopher were 5 and 3 years old, young enough that they'd adapt, old enough that the divorce would mark them. The custody arrangement meant the boys split time between their parents, spending part of the year with Gloria and part with their father. Leopold Stokowski, despite the divorce, remained involved in their lives, encouraging their artistic development, exposing them to music and culture. Stan, the older one, seemed to take after his father's musical talents, but showed no interest in the spotlight. Even as a child, he was quiet, private, content to stay out of the public eye that followed the Vanderbilt name everywhere. He watched his mother navigate the press, the social expectations, the constant scrutiny, and apparently decided early that he wanted no part of it. Where some children of famous parents crave the attention, Stan seemed to instinctively understand that privacy was precious, that life was easier when you weren't constantly performing for an audience. Christopher was different, more sensitive, more artistic, deeply affected by the chaos of his parents' relationship and the split household he navigated. He inherited his father's musical gifts, showed early promise, but even as a young child, he seemed troubled by the weight of his family names. Stokowski carried expectations because of his father. Vanderbilt carried expectations because of his mother. Christopher would later pursue music like his father, but performed under pseudonyms, refusing to trade on either name. He wanted to be known for his work, not his lineage. Wanted his art to stand on its own merit, rather than being elevated or dismissed based on who his parents were. Both boys learned early that being a Vanderbilt came with burdens most people couldn't imagine. Money didn't protect you from pain. Fame didn't give you privacy. Wealth didn't buy the normalcy other kids took for granted. They were Vanderbilts and Stokowskis, which meant expectations from the moment they entered a room, assumptions about who they were before anyone bothered to ask. Gloria did her best to give them stability, but stability is hard to maintain when you're one of the most photographed women in America, when your every relationship makes headlines, when your past includes a custody trial that set legal precedents, and your present includes trying to build a career in art and design while raising 2 boys, largely alone. Gloria married again in 1956, this time to film director Sidney Lumet. The marriage lasted 7 years, but produced no children. Lumet was talented, successful, age-appropriate, everything Leopold Stokowski hadn't been. During their marriage, Lumet directed some of the most acclaimed films of the era: 12 Angry Men, Long Day's Journey into Night, A View from the Bridge. He and Gloria moved in artistic circles, hosted parties, lived a creative life. But something was missing. The spark wasn't there, or it faded, or they wanted different things. When they divorced in 1963, they remained on good terms. No bitterness, no scandal, just two people who'd tried and failed to make it work. Gloria was nearly 40 years old, twice divorced from famous men, mother to two teenage boys who were starting to build their own lives, and still searching for the one thing that had always eluded her: real love, partnership, a marriage that felt like home. She'd had wealth since birth, had achieved success in multiple creative fields, had raised two sons who seemed to be thriving despite the chaos of their upbringing. But she hadn't had the love she'd dreamed of as a child, watching her parents from a distance. And then, in 1964, she found it. The love of her life. Wyatt Emery Cooper was a writer and screenwriter, southern, charming, kind in ways Gloria had never experienced. He was her own age, understood her, saw her as a person rather than an heiress or a symbol. They married on Christmas Eve, 1963, and Gloria would later say it was the only marriage that ever felt right, the only man she would have stayed with forever if fate had allowed it. Together, Gloria and Wyatt created the family life she'd always dreamed of. They raised Stan and Christopher, now teenagers, and had two sons of their own. Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was born on January 27th, 1965. Anderson Hayes Cooper followed on June 3rd, 1967. For the first time in her life, Gloria felt complete. She had a husband she adored, 4 sons, a home filled with love and creativity. Wyatt was an amazing father, patient and present in ways Gloria's own father had never been, in ways she'd never witnessed growing up. The boys thrived. Stan, now in his late teens, started building a life in landscaping and business, choosing a path far from celebrity. Christopher developed his musical career, still fiercely private, still performing under aliases. Carter, the eldest of Gloria and Wyatt's children, was gentle and thoughtful, interested in military history and politics. Anderson, the baby, was bright and curious, already showing signs of the intelligence that would later define his career. For 14 years, they had it. The family Gloria had always wanted, the happiness she'd chased through multiple marriages, the sense of being loved for who she was rather than what she represented. And then, in 1978, it all shattered. The first loss. Wyatt Cooper had a history of heart problems. In January 1978, he underwent open heart surgery at age 50. The operation should have been routine. It wasn't. Wyatt died during the procedure, leaving Gloria a widow at 53, with 4 sons who suddenly had to navigate life without the father who'd anchored their family. Carter was 12 years old. Anderson was 10. Stan was 27. Christopher was 25. Each of them processed the loss differently, but for Anderson and Carter, who'd only ever known the stability Wyatt provided, the death was devastating. Anderson would later say that his father's death radically changed who he was, that the person he'd been before age 10 was more extroverted, more outgoing, more interesting than the person he became after. He grew introverted, protective of his emotions, afraid to get too close to people who might leave. He became obsessed with being there for his mother and his brother Carter, terrified that if he left, something terrible would happen. The fear of loss consumed him in ways he wouldn't fully understand until decades later. But Carter took it even harder. Anderson would describe his older brother as someone who felt things too deeply, who wasn't suited for the rough and tumble of normal life, who absorbed pain in ways that made it impossible to shake. Carter graduated from the elite Dalton School, went to Princeton, excelled academically. But underneath the achievements, something was broken that never quite healed. And Christopher, 25 when his stepfather died, was dealing with his own crisis. In 1978, the same year Wyatt passed away, something happened that would drive Christopher away from his family for the next 38 years: the vanishing. The details have never been fully public. What's known is this: Gloria had a therapist named Christ Zois. At some point in 1978, this therapist interfered in Christopher's relationship with his fiancée, April Sandmeyer. The interference was significant enough that Christopher's engagement fell apart. Whether the therapist had ulterior motives, whether she was manipulating Gloria to gain control over the Vanderbilt fortune, whether she genuinely believed she was helping, the result was catastrophic. Christopher cut off all contact with his family, all of them. His mother, his brothers, everyone. He became a recluse, disappeared into a private life somewhere in New York State, refused all attempts at reconciliation. For Anderson, who was 10 years old and adored his older brother Christopher despite their 15-year age difference, the disappearance was another devastating loss on top of losing Wyatt. First his father died, then his brother vanished. The family that had felt so secure just months earlier was fracturing. Gloria tried to reach Christopher. She never stopped trying. But he wouldn't respond, wouldn't see her, wouldn't allow any contact. Years passed. A decade. 2 decades. Anderson grew up, went to Yale, became a journalist. Carter struggled through his 20s, trying to find his place in a world that felt increasingly difficult to navigate. Stan continued his quiet life in landscaping, married Emily Goldstein, had 2 daughters, Abra and Aurora, stayed close to Gloria, but maintained his privacy. And Christopher remained a ghost, present only in his absence. The son who'd chosen to walk away from everything the Vanderbilt name represented. In 1993, 15 years after Christopher disappeared, Gloria won a lawsuit against her former lawyer and the therapist who'd destroyed her relationship with her son. The court awarded her $1.5 million, a small vindication for the damage done. But the money didn't bring Christopher back. Nothing did. Gloria would never publicly discuss what happened. She respected Christopher's privacy, even as his absence left a permanent hole in the family. When Anderson and Gloria made a documentary in 2016 about their lives and relationship, they deliberately didn't mention Christopher. It wasn't because they'd forgotten him or didn't love him. It was because Gloria knew he valued his privacy above everything else. She wouldn't violate that, even to tell her own story completely. But Christopher's absence meant he wasn't there for what came next. And what came next was the tragedy that would define the rest of Gloria's life. The afternoon of July 22nd, Carter Cooper graduated from Princeton in 1987. He started working at American Heritage magazine as a book editor, focusing on military history and politics. He was 23 years old, brilliant, sensitive, living in New York, trying to build a career and a life. But he was also struggling. He'd recently broken up with his girlfriend, Pearson Marks. The breakup hit him hard, harder than anyone realized at the time. He'd been seeing a therapist for depression. He'd been prescribed medication, including an asthma inhaler that Gloria would later believe played a role in what happened, possibly triggering a psychotic episode. But those are speculations, attempts to find explanation where maybe none exists. On July 22nd, 1988, a Friday, Carter visited Gloria at her penthouse apartment at 10 Gracie Square on Manhattan's Upper East Side. He told her he was planning to move back home. His apartment wasn't working out. He needed to be closer to family. They discussed logistics. Anderson's room was bigger. Carter could take that one. They made plans to have lunch together. Carter's favorite was spaghetti. Gloria said she'd make it. After lunch, Carter stretched out on the sofa for a nap. This was normal, something they'd done countless times. Gloria often read to her sons, even as adults. She picked up a copy of The New Yorker and read Carter a short story called White Angel by Michael Cunningham. The story was about a young man who runs through closed plate glass doors during a party and is killed. They talked about the story when Gloria finished reading. Then Carter drifted off to sleep. Gloria left the room to give him privacy to rest. What happened next would haunt her for the remaining 31 years of her life. Carter woke up in a daze. He didn't know where he was. When Gloria came back and tried to speak to him, he didn't recognize her. He seemed confused, disoriented, not himself. She tried to hold him, to ground him, to bring him back. He pulled away and ran upstairs to Anderson's room, the one they'd been discussing earlier. Gloria followed him, panic rising. When she reached Anderson's room, it was empty. She rushed to the terrace, and there was Carter, sitting on the low stone wall that surrounded the space, 14 stories above the street. She asked what he was doing. He put his arm out to stop her from coming closer. Then he stood up and stared off toward the horizon. She begged him to come down. She pleaded with him, told him she loved him, promised they'd figure out whatever was wrong. He looked at her, and he asked a question that witnesses later reported. He asked if he would ever feel again. Then he let go. Gloria lunged forward, thought for a moment about jumping after him. In that split second, she had to choose whether to lose 2 sons or 1. She chose to stay. Carter fell 14 stories and landed in a graffiti-covered alley behind the building. He was wearing casual clothes and no shoes. He was 23 years old. The time was approximately 7 p.m. Anderson was 21, working abroad as a young journalist. He got the call and had to process that his brother, his only full sibling, the person who'd known him since birth, was gone. Just gone. No warning, no goodbye, no chance to say the things you think you'll always have time to say. The aftermath. Gloria was under a doctor's care that night, in shock, unable to speak to police for hours. When detectives finally interviewed her, she described what had happened, the confusion in Carter's eyes, the way he hadn't seemed to know who she was or where he was. A toxicology report showed no drugs or alcohol in Carter's system. He'd been taking medication for depression and using an asthma inhaler, but nothing that obviously explained the psychotic break Gloria believed she'd witnessed. The funeral was held 4 days later, on July 26, 1988, at St. James Episcopal Church in New York. Carter was buried beside Wyatt, the father he'd lost 10 years earlier, the father whose death had started the unraveling that ended here. Stan was there. Anderson was there. Christopher was not. He'd been estranged for a decade by then, hadn't been in contact, wouldn't have known what happened until he read about it in newspapers, if he read about it at all. Gloria wrote a book about Carter's death, trying to make sense of something that made no sense. She concluded that the asthma inhaler had triggered an allergic reaction that caused the psychotic episode. Medical experts were skeptical, but Gloria needed an explanation, needed something other than the idea that her son had simply chosen to leave. Anderson, in interviews years later, would say that Carter struggled with depression, with fear of the future, with the stress of building a life. He suggested his brother hadn't dealt well with those pressures, but he also repeated their mother's story about Carter waking in a confused state, not knowing who or where he was. The truth is probably that multiple factors combined in the worst possible way at the worst possible moment. Depression, stress, medication, heartbreak, The pressure of being a Vanderbilt in a world that expected things from you that you couldn't deliver. Whatever the cause, the result was permanent. Carter was gone, and Gloria and Anderson were left to figure out how to keep living. Anderson threw himself into work, became a war correspondent, sought out danger in ways that terrified his mother. He would later admit that part of him was testing whether he could survive, whether he deserved to survive when his brother hadn't. He went to Somalia, to Bosnia, to Rwanda, to war zones and conflict areas where life and death hung in the balance every day. He witnessed atrocities, documented suffering, put himself in situations where one wrong move could end everything. It was real in a way dinner parties about facial moisturizers could never be. It was honest, and it gave him something to focus on besides the hole Carter's death had left. When you're ducking sniper fire or interviewing survivors of genocide, you don't have mental space to process personal grief. The work became armor, protection against feeling too much, a way to channel the pain into something productive. Gloria watched her remaining son disappear into war zones and could do nothing to stop him. She'd already lost Carter. She'd lost Christopher to estrangement. Stan had his own life, separate and private. Now Anderson was risking his life in conflicts she couldn't understand, for reasons she grasped intellectually but couldn't accept emotionally. She wanted him safe, wanted him home, wanted to protect him the way she hadn't been able to protect Carter. But Anderson was an adult, making his own choices, driven by demons he was only beginning to understand. Years later, when Anderson started practicing meditation and became more introspective about his career choices, he would articulate what he'd been doing in those early years. He'd needed to be around people where life and death was immediate, where people's voices weren't being heard, where everything was gutted and raw and real. He'd needed to test himself, to see if he could survive situations that should break a person, to prove something he couldn't quite name. The work paid off professionally. Anderson built a reputation as a serious journalist, someone who went where the story was, no matter how dangerous. He worked for Channel 1, then ABC News, eventually landing at CNN, where he would build the career that made him a household name. But the success came at a cost. He remained emotionally distant, afraid to get too close to people, convinced that everyone he loved would leave him one way or another. Gloria kept working too, kept designing, kept creating, kept moving forward because standing still meant confronting what she'd lost. She launched her designer jeans line in the 1970s, became one of the first celebrities to put her name on clothing and make public appearances to promote it. The jeans were hugely successful, made her tens of millions of dollars, turned her into a fashion icon for a new generation. She designed perfumes, home goods, accessories, built a business empire separate from the inherited Vanderbilt wealth. But the money and success couldn't fill the emptiness Carter's death had created. She'd lost her husband. She'd lost one son to death and another to estrangement. She had Stan, steady and reliable, but living his own private life, rarely in the public eye, building his landscaping business and raising his daughters far from the spotlight. She had Anderson, but Anderson was halfway around the world, risking his life in conflicts she couldn't understand, keeping his distance emotionally, even when he was physically present. And she had Christopher, somewhere, alive but unreachable. A son who'd chosen to walk away and never look back. The long silence. 38 years. That's how long Christopher stayed away. He pursued his music career under pseudonyms. He lived in relative seclusion. He had no contact with Gloria, with Anderson, with Stan. His former fiancée, April Sandmeyer, remained in his life in some capacity, but the details of Christopher's day-to-day existence remained a mystery even to his family. Anderson grew up, established himself as a respected journalist, eventually became the anchor of his own CNN show. He won awards, covered major world events, built a career entirely separate from the Vanderbilt name. When people thought of Anderson Cooper, they thought of journalism, not genes or railroads or inherited wealth. He'd done what Christopher had tried to do, created an identity independent of the family legacy. But Anderson never forgot Christopher. He'd been 10 years old when his brother disappeared. Those memories stayed fresh, the older brother he'd adored, the loss that had come right after losing his father. In every interview where Anderson discussed his family, there was a Christopher-shaped absence that nobody talked about. Gloria aged gracefully, remained active and creative well into her 90s. She designed, she painted, she wrote books, she lived. But she never stopped hoping that someday Christopher would come back, that the son who'd vanished would find his way home. In 2016, Gloria was 92 years old. Anderson approached her about making a documentary, a conversation between mother and son about their lives, their losses, the relationship they'd built in the wreckage of so much tragedy. Nothing Left Unsaid premiered on HBO in April 2016. It was intimate, honest, painful in places. They talked about Wyatt, about Carter, about the custody trial from Gloria's childhood, about Anderson's career. They never mentioned Christopher. Not once. It was a deliberate choice, a final act of respect for the privacy Christopher had chosen. But the absence was felt by anyone who knew the family history, anyone who realized that Gloria had 4 sons and the documentary only acknowledged 3. Christopher watched it. Somehow, wherever he was, living whatever life he'd built in seclusion, he saw the documentary his mother and brother had made. And something shifted. Maybe he realized his mother was 92, that time was running out, that the years were finite, and he'd already wasted too many. Maybe seeing Anderson talk about family, about loss, about the brother who'd disappeared when Anderson was just 10 years old, made Christopher understand the hole his absence had created. Maybe watching his mother at that age, still vital but visibly aging, still sharp but clearly in her final years, reminded him that you don't get unlimited chances to reconcile, that some doors close permanently if you wait too long. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe after 38 years of anger, of self-imposed exile, of building a life so separate from the family that had hurt him, Christopher was just tired. Tired of carrying the weight alone, tired of the estrangement, tired of being the missing piece in a family puzzle. Maybe he wanted to come home, whatever that meant after nearly 4 decades away. April Sandmeyer, Christopher's former fiancée who'd remained part of his life in some capacity through all the years of silence, reached out to the family on his behalf. She facilitated contact, helped bridge the gap that had existed since 1978, acted as intermediary between people who didn't know how to talk to each other anymore. The wounds were old, scabbed over, but never fully healed. You don't repair 38 years of estrangement with a phone call or a letter, but you can start. And April helped them start. Anderson confirmed publicly that he and Christopher had reconnected after the documentary aired. They met 3 times in the months following the film's release. 3 meetings after 38 years of nothing. The conversations must have been strange, tentative. 2 men who were brothers by blood, but strangers in every other way that mattered. Anderson had been 10 when Christopher left. Now he was 48, nearly 50, had built an entire life his brother knew nothing about. Christopher had been 25 when he walked away. Now he was 63, had lived more years in estrangement than he'd lived as part of the family. What do you say when that much time has passed? How do you summarize 38 years? Do you explain? Apologize? Just pick up where you left off and pretend the gap doesn't exist. Anderson, ever private about personal matters, never shared details. He confirmed they'd met, that they'd reconciled. That was all. Gloria and Christopher reunited as well, seeing each other for the first time since 1978. She was 92. He was in his 60s. The last time they'd been in the same room, he'd been a young man, angry about the therapist's interference, hurt in ways he couldn't articulate, choosing exile over compromise. Now they were both older, both changed by decades of living, both carrying losses the other hadn't witnessed. Did they talk about what had driven him away? Did Gloria apologize for the therapist, for not protecting him better, for allowing someone to interfere in his life in ways that caused permanent damage? Did Christopher explain why he'd stayed away so long? Why he'd cut off all contact even after the therapist was gone? Even after Gloria had won the lawsuit? Even after Carter died and Anderson needed his brothers? Did they find forgiveness or just acceptance? Did they rebuild something or just acknowledge what had been broken? The details of what they discussed remain private. Christopher had lived his entire adult life away from publicity. He wasn't about to start granting interviews now, wasn't about to explain himself to a world that had never understood his choice in the first place. But he was back, however tentatively, however carefully. The family was together again, at least in some form. For 3 years, that reconciliation held. Gloria got to know the son who'd been a ghost for so long. Anderson got his brother back. Stan, who'd maintained his own quiet existence, had all his brothers accounted for again. It wasn't perfect. 38 years of separation doesn't disappear because you have a few conversations. But it was something. It was more than they'd had. The final goodbye. Gloria Vanderbilt died on June 17, 2019. She was 95 years old, had been diagnosed with advanced stomach cancer just a month before. The diagnosis came suddenly, gave her little time to prepare, but in some ways, that was a mercy. She'd lived a long life, accomplished enormous things, created art and fashion that would outlast her. She'd built businesses, written books, raised 4 sons. She'd survived tragedies that would have broken most people. Her will, filed in Manhattan shortly after her death, surprised many people. Her estate was valued at approximately $1.5 million, far less than the hundreds of millions some had assumed. Gloria had spent lavishly throughout her life, made poor business decisions along with the good ones, given generously to causes she believed in. The Vanderbilt Railroad fortune that had seemed infinite when she was born had dwindled to a small fraction of its former size. She left her Manhattan co-op at 30 Beekman Place to Stan, worth approximately $1.2 million. The remainder of her estate went to Anderson. Christopher received nothing, not because Gloria hadn't reconciled with him, but because their estrangement had lasted too long to change estate planning done years before. Christopher, who'd built a life independent of the Vanderbilt wealth, likely neither expected nor wanted anything. Anderson told interviewers he'd never expected to inherit his mother's fortune anyway. Gloria had been clear throughout his childhood that she didn't believe in inheritance, that she thought it destroyed initiative, that people needed to make their own way. Anderson had built his career believing there was no pot of gold waiting, and he'd said publicly he wouldn't leave a large inheritance to his own son when the time came. He'd learned from Gloria that wealth without purpose corrupts, that work gives meaning, that relying on inherited money robs you of the drive to create your own legacy. Gloria's funeral was private. The family didn't announce which sons attended, respecting the privacy some of them still valued. Anderson delivered a eulogy, not at the funeral, but on CNN, where he could talk about his mother to the viewers who'd watched him grow up on television. He spoke about the last weeks of her life, about telling her he loved her every time he kissed her goodbye, about her looking at him and saying she loved him too, that he knew that, about how he did know it, had known it from the moment he was born, would know it for the rest of his life. She was buried in the Vanderbilt family cemetery on Staten Island, laid to rest beside Wyatt, the husband she'd called the love of her life, and Carter, the son whose death had marked her forever, the last of her immediate family, the last person who'd known her from the beginning, gone. What remains? Leopold Stanislaus Stokowski, better known as Stan, is 74 years old now. He lives quietly with his wife Emily and maintains relationships with his daughters Abra and Aurora. He runs landscaping businesses in New York and New England, stays out of the spotlight, lives the private life he's always preferred. Of Gloria's 4 sons, he's the only one who never courted publicity, never struggled visibly with the Vanderbilt legacy, never seemed burdened by expectations he couldn't meet. Christopher Stokowski is 72. He remains largely a mystery, still private, still reclusive, still pursuing his music under names the public doesn't know. The reconciliation with his family in his final years with Gloria gave him something back. But he hasn't changed who he is or how he lives. He made his choice about privacy decades ago and has stuck with it. Anderson Cooper is 57. He's one of the most recognizable journalists in America, anchors his own show on CNN, contributes to 60 Minutes. In 2020, he became a father through surrogacy, naming his son Wyatt Morgan Cooper after the grandfather the baby would never meet. Anderson has said publicly that he's lonely after his mother's death, that with Wyatt gone since 1978, Carter gone since 1988, and Gloria gone since 2019, he's the last of his immediate family, the last person who remembers what they were before tragedy struck. Carter remains frozen at 23, forever the gentle, thoughtful young man who felt things too deeply, who couldn't find a way to survive the world as it was. His death reshaped everyone who knew him, became the central tragedy in a family that had already known plenty of tragedy. 4 sons, 4 completely different outcomes. Stan found peace in privacy and built a quiet, stable life. Christopher found it by walking away, by refusing to participate in the circus the Vanderbilt name created, by building an identity so separate from his family that he could breathe. Anderson found it in work, in journalism, in creating meaning from chaos by documenting other people's stories. And Carter didn't find it at all, couldn't find it, left behind questions that will never have answers. Gloria spent her life trying to create the family she'd never had as a child. In many ways, she succeeded. She had 4 sons who, in their own ways, loved her. She had the happy marriage with Wyatt, even if it was cut short. She had creative success, business success, cultural impact. But she also had losses that would have destroyed most people. She lost the man she loved. She lost a son to death. She lost another son to estrangement that lasted decades. She watched her children struggle with demons she couldn't fight for them. The Vanderbilt name came with money, prestige, opportunities most people never get. But it also came with pressure, expectations, the weight of being descended from American royalty in a country that claims not to have royalty at all. Each of Gloria's sons dealt with that burden differently. Some carried it, some rejected it, some were crushed by it. There's no neat moral to this story, no lesson that makes the tragedy easier to understand. Some families are marked by loss in ways that shape everything that comes after. The Vanderbilts were one of those families. Gloria's generation, Carter's generation, Anderson's generation, each of them carrying grief that predated them and would outlast them. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There's a family photograph from 1928. 6 sisters lined up with their parents and brother. Nancy, Pamela, Diana, Unity, Jessica, and Deborah Mitford. Beautiful, privileged. Born into one of England's oldest aristocratic families, they looked like they had the world at their fingertips. Within 20 years, one would be imprisoned as a threat to national security. Another would attempt to end her own life with a bullet to the brain in Munich. A third would flee to communist America, disowned by her father. And the remaining 3 would spend the rest of their lives navigating the wreckage left behind. This is the story of how 6 sisters from the same family ended up on opposite sides of the most explosive political divide in modern history, the perfect English upbringing. David Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Redesdale, and his wife Sydney raised their children in a world that barely exists anymore. Asthall Manor in Oxfordshire. Later, Swinbrook House, a home David had built himself in the village of Swinbrook. Grand country estates where servants outnumbered family members and tradition dictated every meal, every conversation, every expectation. The children called their parents Farv and Muv, never mother and father. It was one of those peculiar aristocratic habits that set them apart from ordinary people. David was cold, distant, prone to explosive rages over minor infractions. He once chased a guest out of the house with a shotgun. He had firm opinions about everything and no patience for disagreement. Sydney was stronger, more present, but she held equally firm views on everything from education to politics, and she wasn't shy about imposing them on her daughters. None of the girls attended school. Sydney didn't believe in formal education for daughters. Governesses taught them at home, but the curriculum was erratic at best. The emphasis was on becoming suitable wives for suitable men, learning to run a household, mastering the social graces that would serve them at dinner parties and charity events, French for conversation, music for entertainment, needlework for decoration. Jessica would later describe the education as deliberately limiting, designed to keep them ignorant of the world beyond their estate walls. They were taught just enough to be charming dinner companions, but not enough to think critically about the society they lived in. But Sydney did encourage them to think for themselves, to form opinions, to speak their minds, at least within the family. She believed in debate, in intellectual rigor, in the importance of having strong convictions. It was perhaps the most dangerous gift she could have given them. Nancy was born in 1904, the eldest, sharp-witted, cutting, brilliant. She would become a celebrated novelist, but even as a young woman, her tongue could draw blood. She had a gift for observation and a complete lack of filter. What she saw, she said. What she thought, she expressed. It made her excellent company and a terrible enemy. Pamela arrived in 1907, quiet and content with country life. She loved animals, loved the outdoors, loved the rhythms of rural England. The others called her Woman, a nickname whose origin nobody could quite remember. She seemed immune to the political passions that would consume her sisters. All she wanted was a peaceful life in the countryside. Diana came in 1910, and from the moment she could walk, people noticed. Breathtakingly beautiful. The kind of beauty that stopped conversations mid-sentence. Her friend James Lees Milne would later write that she was the nearest thing to Botticelli's Venus that he had ever seen. But Diana was more than just beautiful. She was intelligent, charismatic, and utterly confident in herself. Unity followed in 1914, born on August 8th, given the middle name Valkyrie, because her father admired Wagner and the German legends. The timing of her birth, just days after World War I began, would seem prophetic, later. Unity as a child was loud, dramatic, attention-seeking in ways that embarrassed her more refined sisters. Jessica arrived in 1917, and from early childhood, she hated everything about the life she'd been born into. The privilege, the assumptions, the casual cruelty of a system that elevated some people simply because of who their parents were. She questioned everything, challenged everyone, and saved every penny she could get her hands on. And finally, Deborah, in 1920, dismissed by her eldest sister Nancy as having the mental age of 9. The cruel nickname stuck for life. Deborah was an afterthought, she later admitted. Not the hoped-for second son, just another girl in a family that already had too many daughters. There was also Tom, born in 1909, the only boy. Handsome, charming, and troubled in ways the family didn't fully understand or acknowledge. He had a schoolboy affair with James Lees Milne. He later became involved with the dancer Tilly Losh. He supported British fascism and would die in Burma during the war, refusing to fight in Europe. They grew up in the 1920s and 1930s, the era of the bright young things. Parties in London, weekends at country estates, debutante balls at Buckingham Palace. The gossip columns tracked their every move. Diana's beauty, Nancy's wit, the younger ones coming up behind them. From the outside, it looked like paradise. 6 beautiful, intelligent women with the world at their feet. But these 6 sisters were about to discover that privilege doesn't protect you from ideology. And ideology, once it takes hold, can destroy everything. The beautiful fascist. Diana Mitford was 18 when she became secretly engaged to Brian Guinness in 1928. Yes, that Guinness family, heir to the barony of Moyne, wealthy beyond imagination. Their engagement created a minor scandal because it was arranged so quickly, but her parents eventually consented. Their wedding in January 1929 made front-page news. 11 bridesmaids, society's elite in attendance. Diana wore a wedding dress with pearl and diamante embroidery on the tight-fitting bodice, with a crystal and silver flower wreath holding her Brussels lace veil in place. The photographs filled the society pages. The young couple looked like a fairy tale come to life. For a while, they lived the dream. A huge fortune. Houses in London, Dublin, and Wiltshire. At the heart of the bright young things set, hosting parties that became legendary. Writers, artists, politicians, aristocrats. Everyone who mattered wanted an invitation to the Guinness parties. Diana had 2 sons with Brian, Jonathan in 1930 and Desmond in 1931. Everything should have been perfect. She had wealth, beauty, social position, healthy children, a devoted husband. But Diana was bored. Then, in February 1932, Diana met Oswald Mosley at a garden party. Mosley was 45, married with children. He had just founded the new party, which would soon become the British Union of Fascists. He had previously been a member of Parliament, first as a Conservative, then as an Independent, then Labour. He had political ambitions that were already trending in a dangerous direction. But he was also charismatic, powerful. The kind of man who filled a room just by entering it. Tall, handsome, with a commanding presence that drew people to him. Diana was 21, and she was fascinated. Within months, she had made her decision. She left Brian Guinness, just left him. The scandal was immense. Divorce was still relatively uncommon in aristocratic circles, especially when initiated by the wife. But Diana didn't just divorce Brian. She did it knowing that Mosley had no intention of leaving his wife, Cynthia. Diana was willing to be Mosley's mistress, indefinitely, to have her name dragged through the papers. to be ostracized by the very society that had celebrated her just 3 years earlier at her wedding. Her father was apoplectic. He cut off contact with her, forbade any family member from seeing her or the man Mosley, as he called him. The family was divided. Some sisters sympathized with Diana, others thought she had destroyed her life for nothing. Then, in 1933, everything changed. Cynthia Mosley died suddenly of peritonitis. Mosley was genuinely devastated. His wife had been the love of his life, or so everyone thought. He immediately began an affair with Cynthia's younger sister, Lady Alexandra Metcalfe, which shocked even those who knew him well. But eventually, he came back to Diana, and she was waiting. While their relationship developed, Diana was discovering a new passion: politics. Mosley's politics. The British Union of Fascists was modelling itself on Mussolini's movement in Italy. The black shirts, the rallies, the emphasis on national strength and racial purity. Diana didn't just support Mosley's politics because she loved him. She genuinely believed in them. In 1934, Diana travelled to Germany with her younger sister Unity. They attended the first major Nuremberg rally after the Nazi consolidation of power. The spectacle was overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of people, torchlight parades, military precision, Hitler speaking to the masses with a passion and conviction that seemed to reach into your soul. Diana was enthralled. This was what Mosley was trying to create in Britain, this sense of destiny, of national rebirth, of purpose larger than individual concerns. Unity, who spoke German fluently, was equally captivated. She maneuvered an introduction to Adolf Hitler in March 1935. Unity brought Diana along. They dined with him at his regular table at the Osteria Bavaria in Munich, talked with him for hours about politics, about England, about the future. Diana found Hitler cultured, well-read, passionate about art and music and architecture. Misunderstood by the British press, who painted him as a crude demagogue, when in reality he was a visionary trying to restore Germany's rightful place in the world. Or so Diana convinced herself. Later, in 1935, Diana and Unity attended another Nuremberg rally, this time as Hitler's honoured guests. They sat in the VIP section. They dined at his table. They attended the Wagner Festival at Bayreuth, meeting the Wagner descendants and listening to the music Hitler loved most. Diana became close friends with Magda Goebbels, wife of the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Magda was 8 years older than Diana, but the two women connected deeply. They confided in each other about their marriages, their hopes, their frustrations. Magda's husband was having affairs. Diana's lover wouldn't marry her. They understood each other. In 1936, Hitler even provided a Mercedes-Benz and chauffeur to transport Diana to the Berlin Olympic Games. She was now firmly embedded in the Nazi inner circle, not as a curiosity or a socialite, but as a true believer. When Diana told Magda that she and Mosley wanted to marry, but couldn't find a place where the British press wouldn't discover them, Magda had a solution. They could marry at the Goebbels' Berlin home. Hitler himself would ensure the press stayed away, and he would attend as guest of honor. On October 6, 1936, Diana Mitford and Oswald Mosley were married in the drawing room of Joseph Goebbels' house on Hermann Göringstrasse in Berlin. Diana wore a pale gold silk tunic. Diana and Unity stood at an upstairs window and watched Hitler walk through the trees of the park-like garden that separated the house from the Reichskanzlei. The leaves were turning yellow. There was bright sunshine. Behind Hitler came an adjutant carrying a box and flowers. The ceremony was brief. The registrar said a few words. They exchanged rings, signed their names. Hitler presented them with a silver-framed photograph of himself as a wedding gift. The next day, the Mosleys returned to England after attending the opening of the Winterhilfswerk at the Sportpalast and dinner at the Reichskanzlei. The marriage remained secret. Only a handful of people knew. Unity, of course. 2 witnesses for Mosley, the Goebbels, and the Führer. The marriage remained secret until 1938, when Diana had her 4th child, Max, her first with Mosley. By then, she didn't care who knew. The secret was out, and Diana faced it with the same confidence she'd shown throughout. She had found what she was looking for: purpose, power, a cause she believed in completely. She would spend the rest of her very long life defending that choice, the girl who loved Hitler. Unity, Valkyrie. Mitford kept a diary. In it, she recorded with absolute precision every time she met Adolf Hitler. She documented 140 meetings. She memorized what he wore, what he said, how he looked at her. She studied his speeches until she could recite passages by heart. She learned German specifically, so she could speak to him without a translator. This wasn't casual admiration. This was devotion that bordered on obsession. Unity was 19 when she first went to Germany with Diana in 1934. She had come out as a debutante in 1932, but social events bored her. At a court ball at Buckingham Palace, she stole the writing paper just to cause a scene. She was looking for something more than the endless round of parties and suitable marriages that awaited her. She found it in Munich. Unity moved there, effectively abandoning England. She positioned herself in the Osteria Bavaria restaurant, knowing Hitler often ate there. She sat at nearby tables, day after day, week after week, waiting for him to notice her. He noticed. Soon she was part of his inner circle, invited to private lunches, given tickets to rallies, introduced to the Nazi elite. Hitler seemed genuinely charmed by this English aristocrat who believed so fervently in his cause. Back in England, Unity's younger sister Jessica shared a bedroom with her. Jessica was moving in the opposite political direction, becoming a dedicated communist. They drew a chalk line down the middle of their room. Jessica's side was decorated with hammers and sickles and pictures of Lenin. Unity's side had swastikas and pictures of Hitler. It started as a game, perhaps. 2 teenage girls pushing boundaries, seeing how far they could take things. But it became deadly serious. Unity wasn't just a social hanger-on in Hitler's circle. She was a true believer. She attended Nuremberg rallies not as a tourist, but as a participant. She gave the Nazi salute. She spoke publicly about the Jewish problem. She believed that Germany and Britain should be natural allies, bound by blood and race. Her family was horrified. Her father had forbidden contact with Diana over her fascist connections. Unity was worse. Diana at least had the excuse of being in love with Mosley. Unity was in love with an ideology, and possibly with Hitler himself. Through it all, Unity kept meticulous records of her time with the Führer, what they discussed over tea, where they walked together, how he looked at her. She treasured these moments more than anything else in her life. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939, Unity was in Munich. She had been there for years by this point, living in a flat paid for by Hitler's government, surrounded by Nazi officials who treated her like one of their own. The news that Britain and Germany were at war devastated her. Everything she had believed, everything she had worked for, was collapsing. Her 2 countries, the 2 things she loved most, were now enemies. That same day, Unity went to the English Garden in Munich. She sat on a bench. She took out a small pistol, a gift from Hitler himself, and she shot herself in the head. She didn't die. The bullet entered her skull, but missed the vital areas that would have killed her instantly. She was found and rushed to a hospital. Hitler paid for her care, visited her, arranged for her to be moved to a facility in neutral Switzerland, where her mother and youngest sister Deborah could retrieve her. When they arrived, they weren't prepared for what they found. Unity had lost 2 stone. Her hair was matted and untouched since the bullet went through her skull. The bullet was still lodged in her brain, inoperable. She couldn't walk. She spoke with difficulty. She was a stranger to them, changed entirely. They brought her back to England in an ambulance coach attached to a train. Every jolt was agony for her. The press swarmed the station when they arrived. Unity's only comment was that she was glad to be in England, even if she wasn't on their side. The bullet had caused massive brain damage. Unity would never fully recover. She couldn't remember the incident itself, or claimed she couldn't. She lived with relatives under police surveillance. The vibrant, dangerous woman who had dined with Hitler was gone. What remained was someone diminished, broken, unable to articulate the thoughts that had once consumed her. Unity died on May 28, 1948, of complications from the gunshot wound. She was 33 years old. She had lived long enough to see Hitler's death and the complete destruction of everything he stood for. Whether she understood that, whether it brought her any peace or regret, no one could say. She was buried in the churchyard at Swinbrook, near the family home. Diana attended the funeral, the communist who ran away. Jessica Mitford opened a bank account when she was 12 years old. She called it her running away account. Every bit of money she could scrape together went into it. Pocket money, birthday gifts, anything she could save. She was determined to escape. Jessica described her childhood as torture. Not physical abuse, but the suffocating predictability of it all. The governesses, the isolation from other children, the expectation that she would grow up, marry someone suitable, and fade into the background of aristocratic life like her mother and grandmother before her. She rebelled in the only way available to her at first: ideology. While Unity was plastering her side of their shared bedroom with swastikas, Jessica was reading everything she could find about communism, the economic depression, the plight of workers, the injustice of inherited privilege. They argued constantly. 2 sisters, barely a year apart in age, moving toward opposite extremes of the political spectrum. Jessica was 19 when she fell in love with her second cousin, Esmond Romilly. He was Winston Churchill's nephew by marriage, though rumours swirled that he might actually be Churchill's illegitimate son. He had just returned from Spain, where he'd been fighting with the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War, wounded, suffering from dysentery, but committed absolutely to the fight against fascism. He was everything Jessica's family wasn't: committed to the cause, willing to risk everything, uninterested in money or status or the things that mattered to aristocrats. He saw through the pretense. He rejected the privilege he'd been born into. Jessica was infatuated. They eloped to Spain in 1937, while the Civil War was still raging. The scandal made front-page news across Britain, the well-connected young couple running off to a war zone, Churchill's nephew and a Mitford girl, both from families that mattered, both throwing it all away for politics and love. Jessica's family was beside themselves. Her mother begged her to come home. Her father was furious, threatening legal action to force her return. Jessica was still a minor. She needed parental permission to marry. But Jessica had made her choice. She would rather live in poverty with Esmond than in luxury with anyone her family approved of. After some legal difficulties caused by their relatives' opposition, Jessica and Esmond finally married. They moved to London and deliberately chose to live in the East End, a poor industrial area. This wasn't slumming. This was Jessica's politics in action. She wanted to live among the working class, to understand their struggles, to be part of the fight for social justice. Jessica gave birth to their daughter, Julia Decker Romilly, at home on December 20th, 1937. For a brief time, Jessica had what she wanted: a family of her own, a husband who shared her beliefs, a life that meant something beyond social status. Then Julia died of measles when she was just a few months old. The grief was overwhelming. Jessica and Esmond made a decision. They would leave England, start over somewhere new, somewhere they could escape the memories and the family pressures and build something different. Grief-stricken, Jessica and Esmond decided to start over. They emigrated to the United States in 1939, just as war was breaking out in Europe. They traveled around America, working odd jobs wherever they could find them. Bar tending, selling stockings door to door. Anything to make ends meet. They were poor, but they were free. Free from the expectations of their families. Free from the rigid class structure of England. Free to be whoever they wanted to be. Jessica gave birth to another daughter, Constantia Romilly, called the Donk or Dinky, on February 9th, 1941, while they were living in Washington, D.C. with Virginia and Clifford Durr, contemporaries who shared their progressive politics. Then came World War II. Esmond enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Jessica was living in D.C., considering joining him once he was posted to England. They made plans, talked about their future, about what they would do after the war. On November 30th, 1941, Esmond went missing in action on his way back from a bombing raid over Nazi Germany. His plane went down somewhere over the North Sea. His body was never recovered. Jessica was 24 years old, a widow, a single mother in a foreign country, her first child dead from disease. Her husband lost over the same Germany that her sisters Diana and Unity had embraced. The grief was incalculable. But Jessica didn't break. She threw herself into war work to survive. Through this, she met Robert Treuhaft, an American civil rights lawyer. He was committed to the same causes she believed in: social justice, workers' rights, civil rights. They married in 1943, and Jessica finally found some stability. She became an American citizen in 1944, formally cutting her ties to the aristocratic England she'd fled. They had 2 sons together, Nicholas, born in 1944, and Benjamin, born in 1947. But tragedy struck again when Nicholas was killed in 1955, hit by a bus. Another child lost, another grief to carry. But Jessica kept fighting. She and Robert became active members of the Communist Party in 1943. This wasn't casual membership. They were true believers. Jessica spent the 1950s working as executive secretary of the local Civil Rights Congress chapter. She was involved in campaigns to stop wrongful executions, to end segregation, to fight against the forces of McCarthyism that were sweeping America. In 1953, at the height of the Red Scare and the anti-communist hysteria, Jessica and Robert were summoned to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was the nightmare scenario for anyone with progressive politics. Testify and betray your friends and colleagues. Refuse and face consequences. They refused. Refused to name radical groups and friends. Refused to testify about their participation in communist organizations. They were labeled as unresponsive and dismissed. But they didn't break. They didn't give the committee what it wanted. Jessica and Robert resigned from the Communist Party in 1958. They hadn't abandoned their ideals. Far from it. But they had come to believe they could pursue those ideals more effectively outside the rigid party structure. The revelations about Stalin's crimes in Khrushchev's secret speech had shaken them. The party had become, in Jessica's words, rather useless. but she never stopped fighting for the causes she believed in. In 1960, Jessica published her first book, Hons and Rebels, published in the United States as Daughters and Rebels. It was a memoir about growing up in the Mitford household. Sharp, funny, deeply critical of the aristocratic world she'd fled. She pulled no punches about her family's peculiarities, the isolation, the eccentric education, the political extremism that tore them apart. Her family, predictably, was not pleased. But the book was a success. Jessica had found her voice as a writer, and it was as sharp and uncompromising as she was. Then came The American Way of Death in 1963, an exposé of the funeral industry's abusive practices, the way funeral homes exploited grieving families, the unnecessary expenses, the emotional manipulation, the entire corrupt system built on people's vulnerability in their darkest moments. The book was a massive bestseller. It changed the funeral industry, led to reforms, saved families from exploitation. Jessica had used her writer's gift to attack an institution she saw as fundamentally corrupt and exploitive. She wrote more books, gave lectures, remained an activist until the end of her life. She approached motherhood with what her children described as benign neglect and matter-of-fact parenting, not touchy-feely, but present in her own way. Over the decades, Jessica grew closer to her mother Sydney through letters. They reconciled somewhat, though they never saw eye to eye on politics. But Jessica remained estranged from her sister Diana for the rest of her life. That divide was unbridgeable. Diana had supported Hitler. Jessica had watched her beloved Esmond die fighting against everything Hitler represented. How do you forgive that? How do you sit across a table from someone who had cheered for the regime that killed your husband? Jessica never could. She died in 1996, aged 78, in Oakland, California. She had a simple, inexpensive funeral and memorial service, exactly as she had wanted. No exploitation, no unnecessary expense, no hypocrisy. Deborah, the youngest sister, the one who had maintained relationships with all of them despite everything, called Jessica the night before she died. One last conversation between two women who had started in the same nursery but had ended up in completely different worlds. The price they all paid. In May 1940, shortly after the outbreak of World War II, both Diana Moseley and her husband Oswald were arrested under Defense Regulation 18B. The regulation allowed for detention without trial of people considered threats to national security. Diana had just given birth 11 weeks earlier to her son Max. She was nursing him when they came for her. She was taken to Holloway Prison in London, separated from her newborn. For 6 months, Diana was held alone, away from both her baby and her husband. Then the authorities relented and allowed the Mosleys to share accommodation within the prison. They lived together in a house within the prison grounds for the next 3 years. The conditions were harsh. They were prisoners, after all. But they had each other. They grew vegetables, read extensively. Oswald studied classics, particularly books about politics and war, focusing on key historical figures. Diana wrote letters, endless letters to anyone who would read them, protesting their detention. MI5 documents released decades later, in 2002, described Diana in chilling terms. She was wildly ambitious, the documents said, far cleverer and more dangerous than her husband. She would stick at nothing to achieve her ambitions. She was a public danger. Her own sister Nancy had reported Diana's remarks to M115, described her as a devoted fascist and admirer of Hitler who sincerely desired the downfall of Britain. Nancy believed Diana was genuinely dangerous, so dangerous that years later, even after Diana and Oswald were released, Nancy and Jessica both petitioned Churchill's wife, Clementine, who was their cousin, to have Diana re-imprisoned. They believed she was a true threat. Diana and Oswald were held without trial. No charges, no opportunity to defend themselves. Just years of imprisonment based on who they were and what they believed. In November 1943, the Home Secretary Herbert Morrison ordered their release. The Mosleys were placed under house arrest until the end of the war. Even after the war ended in 1945, they were denied passports until 1949. They couldn't leave Britain, couldn't travel, were watched constantly. The British government had broken them socially, if not spiritually. After 1949, when they finally got their passports back, Diana and Oswald moved to France. They settled eventually in the Temple de la Gloire near Paris. Beautiful, isolated, far from the Britain that had rejected them. Diana lived there for most of the rest of her very long life. She counted the Duke and Duchess of Windsor among her friends, people who, like her, had been ostracized by British society for their choices. She was permanently unwelcome at the British Embassy in Paris. Her presence was considered too controversial, too embarrassing. She wrote books, 2 memoirs, A Life of Contrasts in 1977 and Loved Ones in 1985. In 1980, she wrote a biography of the Duchess of Windsor. She gave interviews. She wrote book reviews. And she never, not once, not ever, expressed regret for her political beliefs or her association with Adolf Hitler. In her 80s, she became the lead book reviewer for the London Evening Standard during A.N. Wilson's tenure as literary editor. She was skilled, insightful. People read her reviews. Then Max Hastings became the editor of the newspaper in 1996. He was asked to stop running Diana's reviews. Hastings reportedly said he didn't want any more bloody Lady Hitler in his newspaper. Diana died in Paris in August 2003 during a European heatwave. She was 93 years old. She had outlived almost everyone who remembered the war, outlived most of her critics, outlived all of her sisters except Deborah. In interviews late in her life, Diana said she was sure Hitler was to blame for the extermination of the Jews. He was to blame for everything, and she said this as someone who approved of him. It was an extraordinary statement, an acknowledgement of the horrors without any accompanying regret for her support. She was buried at Swinbrook, in the churchyard next to Unity and Nancy, 3 of the 6 sisters, together again in death. Nancy Mitford became one of the most celebrated novelists of the 20th century. The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate were bestsellers that are still read today. But her personal life was difficult. A series of unsuitable attachments, a long affair with Gaston Pulowski, a French colonel who was the love of her life but who never fully committed to her. Nancy died in 1973, aged 68. She had watched her sisters tear the family apart over politics and never quite recovered from it. Pamela, the quiet one, married the wealthy scientist Derek Jackson, but it was never a happy marriage. They divorced. Pamela spent the rest of her life with Italian horsewoman Giuditta Tomasi in Gloucestershire, far from the political storms that consumed her sisters. She died in 1994, aged 86. Tom, the only brother, supported British fascism and refused to fight in Europe during the war. He was sent to Burma instead, where he died of his wounds in 1945, aged 36. Deborah married Andrew Cavendish in 1941. When Andrew's older brother was killed in action in 1944, Andrew became heir to the Dukedom of Devonshire. In 1950, Deborah became the Duchess of Devonshire. She transformed Chatsworth House into one of the most successful stately homes in Britain. She wrote several books. She maintained relationships with all of her sisters, even serving as the sister they all wrote to, the one who tried to keep some semblance of family unity despite the ideological chasms between them. Deborah visited Unity when she was slowly dying from her gunshot wound. She brought Diana back from Germany. She stayed in touch with Jessica, even when the rest of the family had given up. She attended Nancy's deathbed. She was the keeper of the family letters, the repository of their shared history. Deborah was the last Mitford sister to die on September 24, 2014, aged 94. With her death, the extraordinary correspondence between the six sisters finally came to an end. What remains? The Mitford family photograph from 1928 shows six beautiful young women who had no idea what was coming. They couldn't have known that within a decade they would be on opposite sides of a war, that some of them would be imprisoned, that one would shoot herself in the head for love of a dictator, that another would flee to America and denounce everything she'd been born into. They were raised in the same house, by the same parents, with the same expectations. But they made radically different choices about what to believe and how to live. Diana chose fascism and never wavered, even after seeing where it led. Unity chose Hitler and paid with her sanity and eventually her life. Jessica chose communism and civil rights, burning her bridges with half her family. Nancy chose literature and love, documenting it all with a novelist's eye. Pamela chose privacy and horses. Deborah chose duty and preservation. None of them lived ordinary lives. None of them faded quietly into the background. They were too smart, too opinionated, too convinced of their own rightness. But the cost was immense. Prison, exile, estrangement, brain damage, early death. The family never fully recovered from the political divisions that tore it apart in the 1930s and 1940s. Today, the Mitford sisters are remembered as a cautionary tale about privilege and extremism, about what happens when ideology matters more than family, about the seductive power of certainty in uncertain times. Their letters, thousands of them spanning 8 decades, have been published and studied. Novels and television shows have dramatized their lives. Historians have analyzed their choices. But the question that haunts everything is simple. How did these siblings end up in such radically different places? Maybe it was their mother's encouragement to think for themselves. Maybe it was the isolation of their upbringing, cut off from other influences. Maybe it was the particular moment in history they came of age in, when the old certainties were crumbling and extreme ideologies rushed in to fill the void. Or maybe it was just who they were. 6 individuals who happened to be sisters, each following her own path regardless of where it led or who it hurt. They called themselves the Mitford sisters, but in the end, they could barely stand to be in the same room together. Diana and Jessica never reconciled. Unity's attempt to end her life divided them further. Nancy's novels exposed family secrets. The bonds that should have united them became the very things that tore them apart. The grand estates are gone, or transformed into tourist attractions. The titles remain, but mean less than they once did. The British aristocracy that produced the Mitford sisters is a shadow of what it was, but the sisters themselves remain fascinating because they represent something universal. The way beliefs can become more important than blood, the way conviction can turn into fanaticism, the way 6 people can start from the same place and end up in completely different worlds. Their story is a reminder that wealth and status offer no shield against terrible choices, that beauty and intelligence don't guarantee wisdom, that sometimes the people closest to you can become complete strangers, and that once you've chosen your side, once you've committed yourself to a cause, the way back is almost impossible to find. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.